Black Waitress slips Billionaire a note, "You're in serious trouble, what happens next will change his life." The midday sun streamed through the windows of a small diner on 5th and Pine, where Robert Blackwell sat in his usual booth, his laptop open and his mind focused on a major deal. A billionaire CEO, Robert was accustomed to making big decisions, but today, something felt different. As his waitress, Tasha, brought him his coffee, she silently slid a folded note across the table. Robert glanced at it, then at her, but she was already moving away. Unfolding the note, he read the simple message, "You're in serious trouble." Amused, Robert dismissed it as nonsense, pocketing the note without a second thought. Little did he know, within hours, a corporate scandal would emerge, threatening everything he had built. And it all began with a simple note from a waitress. "Where are you watching from today? Speech balloon, let us know in the comments." The diner had the same worn charm it always did, chipped porcelain mugs, the soft clink of silverware against plates, and the smell of coffee that seemed to stick in the air. Tasha moved efficiently, refilling cups and taking orders with a smile that was genuine, but always hidden behind a quiet exhaustion. She had seen it all before, the customers who came and went, the faces that barely looked up from their phones or their plates. But Robert Blackwell, sitting alone in the corner booth, was different. She couldn't put her finger on why, but there was something in the way he carried himself, the cold confidence in his eyes, the power that seemed to follow him even into a small diner. He wasn't just any businessman. He was a titan. A man whose name floated through the air in boardrooms, whose signature alone could seal deals worth millions. As Tasha set down his coffee, she noticed something, an uneasy energy in the way Robert gripped his phone, a hint of tension behind his calm facade. She hadn't overheard much of his conversation with the other executives at the table earlier, but she could tell that something was weighing on him. The kind of thing that you couldn't shake, no matter how hard you tried. "Anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice smooth and professional. Robert's eyes lifted from his phone, meeting hers for the first time with an intensity that caught her off guard. "No, thank you," he replied, his voice crisp, dismissive almost, as if he were trying to ignore the weight of the world on his shoulders. But Tasha, in all her quiet wisdom, could sense it. The very real feeling that Robert was teetering on the edge of something far bigger than himself. As she turned to leave, a thought crossed her mind, one that had been lingering for a while. She had grown up in this town. She had seen things, corporate greed, exploitation, environmental destruction, and the toll it took on the people. And this man, this billionaire CEO, represented everything she despised. But she wasn't the kind of person to let that slide. She knew something about him, about his company, something he didn't even know himself. Without thinking, she scribbled a quick note on a napkin, folded it carefully, and slid it across the table. "You're in serious trouble," it read in bold, simple letters. Robert, surprised, looked at the note, then back up at her, his eyebrows furrowing. "Excuse me." Tasha stood tall, her face composed, but her eyes sharp. "Don't say I didn't warn you," she said quietly before walking away, leaving him staring at the cryptic message in disbelief. That afternoon, as Robert left the diner and headed back to his sleek black car, a storm was brewing that he couldn't yet see. The deal he had just closed, the one he believed would push his company to new heights, was about to implode. Minutes later, his phone buzzed. An urgent news alert flashed across the screen. "Breaking news. Major environmental scandal hits Blackwell Enterprises. Investigation launched into shady dealings." Tasha's words echoed in his mind, a quiet warning that seemed more and more like a prediction. The quiet chaos had just begun. Robert's world began to unravel as the details of the scandal made headlines. But there was more to this than he realized. Tasha's involvement in environmental law, and her unexpected role in the redemption of his company, was just beginning. Could she help him fix the mess he had made? Would he even allow her to? The clock was ticking, and Robert didn't know where to turn. Robert's phone buzzed incessantly in the days following the scandal's eruption. His assistant was calling every hour, demanding answers, updating him on the latest media frenzy. Lawyers and PR teams were now in full crisis mode. Robert hadn't expected this. His company had always been built on strategy, precision, and, more often than not, ruthless decision-making. But this was different. This wasn't a crisis that could be solved with money or influence. This was about something far more delicate: reputation, integrity, and something even more important: the people who worked for him. The morning after the news broke, Robert found himself standing at the edge of his private jet, staring out at the horizon. The weight of it all pressed down on him. His legacy, his reputation, the deal that was supposed to secure his empire now unraveling at his feet. He had made enemies in his rise, but the one person he hadn't anticipated was the one who could very well change everything: Tasha. He hadn't thought much of her cryptic note at first. It seemed like a throwaway gesture, just a waitress, after all. What could she possibly know about the corporate world? But now, as the scandal dominated the headlines, her words felt strangely prophetic. Tasha had a presence, a quiet power that Robert couldn't shake. She was just another small-town worker, someone who had probably never seen a single boardroom in her life. Yet she seemed to know exactly where the cracks were in his empire. He couldn't ignore it anymore. So, he went back to the diner. It was a dreary Tuesday morning, the kind of day that made everything feel heavier, as if the gray skies were bearing down on him. Robert stepped into the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly as he walked in. The scent of coffee and frying bacon lingered in the air, familiar and comforting. He sat in the corner booth, trying to remain inconspicuous, though he knew that wouldn't last long. Tasha was already behind the counter, serving the regulars with the same graceful efficiency that had struck him the first time. She looked up as he sat down. Their eyes met for a moment, and for the briefest second, she looked surprised to see him again. But there was no judgment in her gaze, no smugness. Just quiet recognition. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice steady. Robert nodded, watching her as she poured the dark liquid into a cup. There was something calming about her demeanor, even as the storm of his life continued to rage outside. Tasha set the cup down, then slipped into the seat across from him without a word. She didn't ask how he was doing, didn't offer empty condolences. She just waited, letting the silence stretch between them, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Robert spoke. "I need your help," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I made a mistake. A big one. And now, it's too late to fix it the way I usually do." Tasha's expression softened, but she didn't speak. She just waited, watching him with those eyes that seemed to see through all his bravado. "I'm the one who pushed that deal through," he continued. "I didn't think about the long-term consequences. I didn't think about the environment or the people it would hurt. Now it's all crashing down, and I'm not sure how to stop it." For the first time since the scandal broke, Robert felt vulnerable. Not the kind of vulnerability that came from fear or weakness, but the kind that came from realizing that all his power, all his wealth, meant nothing in the face of what was really at stake. Tasha didn't respond right away. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the silence between them stretching out before she finally spoke. "I know you're trying to fix things. But you can't just throw money at this, Robert. You can't buy your way out of a mess like this," she said quietly, her tone matter of fact. "It's about doing the right thing. Not just for your company, but for the people who depend on it. For the planet that you've been taking from." The weight of her words settled over him. She wasn't wrong. He had built his empire on calculated risks and tough decisions, but never once had he thought about the bigger picture. Never once had he considered how far-reaching his actions could be, how much damage they could cause. Tasha's calm presence was a stark contrast to the chaos of Robert's world. There was no fanfare, no grand gestures. Just a quiet, unshakable confidence that he hadn't expected. "I can help you," she said, breaking his thoughts. "But it's not going to be easy. You'll have to make some real changes. And you'll have to give up your pride." Robert's heart sank, but he knew she was right. This wasn't going to be about ego or power. It was about doing what was right, even if it meant facing the very thing he had avoided for years: accountability. He sat back in the booth, his mind racing, but for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Tasha's unexpected intervention would be the start of his redemption. Robert's willingness to change had set him on an unexpected path, but the road ahead was still uncertain. As Tasha prepared to help him clean up the mess he had made, there was one question left. Could he truly walk away from everything he had built, or would the pressure of his empire tear him apart? The days following his conversation with Tasha were a blur of sleepless nights and endless meetings. Robert spent hours poring over reports, calling lawyers, and meeting with environmental experts. The scandal had exploded into a full-fledged crisis. Investors were panicking, and his board of directors was losing confidence in his leadership. He was no longer the powerful CEO of a thriving company. He was a man trying to piece together the wreckage of his own creation. But amidst all the chaos, Tasha's words lingered in his mind. "You can't buy your way out of this, Robert. You have to do the right thing." And for the first time in his life, Robert realized that she was right. He couldn't just fix this with a check or a PR stunt. He had to make real, meaningful changes, ones that would cost him far more than he had ever imagined. That's when the true weight of the situation hit him. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about the people whose lives had been affected by the damage caused by his decisions. The workers in the factories, the families in the small towns where the environmental destruction was taking place, the communities that relied on the very resources his company had been exploiting. All of them had been forgotten in Robert's drive for success. And now, it was his job to make it right. The first step, Tasha told him, was a public apology. A full, transparent admission of the company's wrongdoing. Robert had spent his entire career running from accountability, always finding a way to shift blame or minimize responsibility. Now, he had no choice but to face the truth. Robert sat down at his desk late one night, his hands trembling slightly as he began to write. It was the hardest letter he had ever penned. In it, he confessed to the mistakes he had made, outlined the damage his company had caused, and most importantly, promised to make amends. For the first time in his career, he wasn't concerned with how the public would perceive him. He was concerned with doing the right thing. When he finished the letter, he read it over again. The words were simple, but they were sincere. It wasn't the polished, rehearsed corporate language he was used to. This was raw, unfiltered honesty. The next morning, Robert sent the letter to every major news outlet, along with a video statement where he stood before the camera and took full responsibility for his actions. The video was brief, but it carried weight. Robert looked different than he ever had before, vulnerable, human, and, most importantly, remorseful. But the apology was just the beginning. As Robert watched the response pour in, something unexpected happened. The public, who had once worshipped him as a titan of industry, now saw him as something else entirely. A man who had made a monumental mistake but was willing to own up to it. The support he received was overwhelming, but the hardest part was yet to come. Tasha had made it clear that this was a long road, and the real work was in the actions that followed. Robert had promised to turn the company around, to make it not just profitable, but ethical. But how? He met with environmentalists, sustainability experts, and even local community leaders. Slowly but surely, he began to implement changes. The company shifted its focus from short-term profits to long-term sustainability. They began investing in green technologies, cleaning up the mess they had made, and finding ways to help the communities they had harmed. Tasha, who had been at his side through it all, was there to guide him every step of the way. She never asked for credit. She just showed up, offering advice, helping him navigate the complexities of environmental law, and reminding him of the bigger picture. She was more than a waitress now. She was Robert's partner, not in business, but in life. But even as Robert worked to restore his company's reputation, there was still something gnawing at him. He had changed his company. He had made a difference in the world. But had he made a difference in his own life? Tasha was everything he had never expected. She was wise, compassionate, and fearless in ways he admired. She didn't let him off the hook, didn't allow him to get comfortable in his success. She held him accountable, just like he had learned to do with his company. And yet, despite all the progress they had made together, Robert still hadn't confronted the most difficult question of all. How could he rebuild his relationship with the woman who had been the first to see through his armor? The woman who had been the catalyst for his transformation. Tasha was there, always, but she was still guarded. She hadn't fully opened up to him, hadn't allowed herself to believe that he could truly change. She was hesitant, and Robert couldn't blame her. He had broken promises before. He had let her down all those years ago. He had no grand gestures, no flashy declarations. Just a simple truth. He was there. And he would keep showing up. Robert had made significant strides, but his internal journey was far from over. As Tasha watched him, she saw the man who had once been driven solely by ambition, now slowly, painfully, becoming someone she could trust. Yet, was it enough? Could their relationship withstand the weight of the past, or would it crumble under the pressure of his past mistakes? Robert sat in his office late one night, his head in his hands. The walls of his sleek, modern office felt smaller than they ever had before. The weight of the day, the interviews, the meetings, the constant questioning of his motives, had taken its toll. He had repaired his company's reputation, changed the entire direction of the business, but his personal life still felt adrift. He had spent so many years building an empire, all the while neglecting the people who mattered most. And now, the woman who had once been the reason he had stayed grounded, the one who had seen through the arrogance and ambition, was out of his reach. Tasha had been a constant presence in his life, but he had never truly allowed himself to be present for her. In the days following their last conversation, Robert had come to realize something startling. All of his success, all the accolades and wealth, meant nothing without her. The biggest business transformation he had ever led paled in comparison to the personal transformation he needed to make. He had learned to be a better leader, but now, he needed to learn how to be a better man. A man who deserved someone as selfless and strong as Tasha. Robert had no grand speeches or dramatic proposals. He didn't need to. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't something he could fix with a check or a power move. This was about showing Tasha that he had learned, not just how to run a company, but how to show up for the people he cared about. How to be real. How to make the choice to stand by her, not just when it was easy, but when it was hard. As the week passed, Robert made it his mission to be present, not just for the company, but for Tasha. He found ways to help at the diner without being noticed. He'd show up early, work quietly behind the scenes, and leave before she could thank him. The first time she noticed, her expression was one of disbelief. "What are you doing here?" she asked with a smile, wiping down the counter. "I'm just helping," Robert replied simply. "Is that okay?" Tasha just nodded, the briefest moment of warmth in her eyes before she masked it again with her usual guarded expression. As Robert's actions slowly spoke louder than his words, Tasha began to let her guard down. She didn't know if she was ready to believe in him again, but she could see that he was trying. He was doing the hard work. He wasn't rushing her. He was just there. But it wasn't until the next rainy afternoon when Robert took the final step that would bring everything to light. He waited outside the diner as the rain poured down. He'd seen her rush out to her car after another long shift before, but today, he was determined to be there. When she finally emerged, he didn't hesitate. He approached her slowly, his heart beating louder than the storm. Tasha didn't say anything at first. She just glanced at him, the rain dripping from her hair, her face tired but not unkind. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded, his gaze soft but sincere. "I know. But I want to." The tension between them was palpable. Tasha's hand rested lightly on the door handle of her car, her fingers trembling slightly. Robert stood, waiting, as though giving her the space to choose. The storm raged around them, but in this quiet moment, time seemed to slow. Finally, Tasha spoke, her voice steady now. "Why didn't you stay before?" Robert took a step closer. "I didn't know how to. I wasn't ready. But I am now." Tasha's eyes met his, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she saw the man who had once been full of promises and big dreams. But now, he wasn't just talking about what he could offer. He was showing her with every small act that he was ready to stand by her side, not for what he could gain, but for who she was. "You don't have to be perfect," she said, her voice trembling with something between hope and caution. "You just have to be real." "I can do that," Robert whispered, his hand extending to hers. "I'll be here. I want to be here." The rain continued to pour, but for the first time, neither of them cared. It wasn't the perfect moment they had once dreamed of, but it was real. And for the first time in years, both of them felt the weight of what it meant to truly connect with someone. The next few weeks were filled with small moments of growth. Robert and Tasha didn't rush anything. There was no grand declaration, no flashing lights. But Robert, who had once been driven only by ambition, had changed. Tasha wasn't just a part of his past anymore. She was the center of his present. And though the road ahead wasn't without its challenges, it no longer felt impossible. In the quiet of those moments, they found each other again, not in the grand gestures of fame or fortune, but in the simplicity of shared silence, trust, and understanding. If you've enjoyed this story, please remember to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Weeks turned into months, and Robert and Tasha found a rhythm together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Tasha had learned to trust Robert again, slowly, but surely. She could see the effort he was putting into their relationship, not just in words, but in actions. The billionaire CEO, once cold and distant, had become someone who understood the value of small, everyday moments. As for Robert, the changes within him were more profound than any business transformation he had ever led. He wasn't just fixing his company anymore. He was fixing the relationships he had neglected, starting with Tasha. They spent evenings walking through the park after dinner, or just sitting in the quiet of the diner, letting time pass without needing to rush. Robert found joy in the simplicity of life with Tasha. They didn't need anything extravagant to feel fulfilled. A shared meal, a conversation, a moment of laughter, those were the things that made his world whole now. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Tasha's small house, a warm breeze flowing through the trees, Robert turned to her. She was laughing at something Jonah had said, a twinkle in her eyes that made his heart skip a beat. "You've changed my life, Tasha," Robert said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "In ways I never imagined." Tasha smiled at him, her eyes full of understanding. "You did that for yourself, Robert. I'm just here to remind you that you're worth it." There was no grand declaration, no moment of fireworks. Just a quiet understanding between two people who had lived through their own storms and come out on the other side stronger. A few weeks later, Tasha took a deep breath before looking at Robert, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "You know, you're not so bad after all. I think I'll keep you around." Robert laughed, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "I'm glad you think so. Because I plan to stick around, for good." In the coming months, Robert stayed committed to making the world a better place, not just for his company, but for the people he loved. He no longer lived for the next big deal or the next opportunity. He had learned the importance of staying, of being present in the lives of those who mattered most. Tasha, too, found a balance between her past and present. The scars on her wrist, once a painful reminder of what she had been through, no longer defined her. She had grown stronger from them. And with Robert by her side, she began to see that her past didn't have to hold her back. It was part of her, yes, but it didn't control her future. As they stood side by side, looking out over the city that had once seemed so far from their reach, they realized something profound. They had each other, and that was all they truly needed. If this story warmed your heart or reminded you of someone special, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll see you again soon. The sun was setting over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the land. And in that quiet moment, Robert and Tasha knew that this was only the beginning of their journey together. The story they had written, filled with hope, second chances and redemption, was just the start of something beautiful.